Before we start, please subscribe and hit the notification bell to get updates on our new stories. Now, enjoy. The sun hung low over the streets of Lagos, painting everything in a soft, golden glow. A young girl named Amara walked carefully along the uneven road, her worn sandals scraping against the dirt. Her bag was light, just a few notebooks and a pencil stub, but every step felt heavy. She could hear laughter behind her, the kind that digs under your skin and makes your shoulders ache. A group of classmates pointed at her torn uniform, their voices sharp and mocking. Amara tried to ignore them, focused on getting to the market to help her mother sell vegetables, but it was hard. The words kept bouncing in her head, replaying in endless loops. Her mother had always told her, "You're stronger than they think, Amara." But in moments like this, that strength felt like a thin shield against a storm. She reached the market, where the smell of fried dough and roasted peppers filled the air. Her mother gave her a tired smile and handed her a basket of tomatoes. Amara moved between the stalls, careful not to bump into anyone, aware of how small she felt among the polished shoes and fancy bags of other kids who had parents that never had to worry about how to pay school fees. When she returned home that evening, she sat on the cracked cement steps outside their tiny house. The sun had dipped lower, turning the sky a mix of orange and pink. Her hands ached from carrying the tomatoes, and her feet were sore. She stared at the shadows stretching across the wall, thinking about how her classmates would never know the weight she carried every day. Not the weight of their words, not the weight of her family's struggles, but the weight of knowing that one day she had to change this story for herself. Evenings were her favorite time, the only quiet moments when she could breathe. She opened her notebook and began writing, scribbling dreams in messy handwriting. One day, she wrote, "I will make a life where no one can mock me or my family. One day, people will know my name not because of what I lack, but because of what I can do." She tucked the notebook under her pillow that night, the words burning bright in her mind like a promise she couldn't ignore. The next morning, she woke to the sounds of the city starting again. Cars honked in the distance, people shouted to one another, and hawkers called out their prices. Amara joined her mother at the market, determined to move faster today, sell more than yesterday. Every coin she earned felt like a small victory, a step toward a world where no one could laugh at her. And in those moments, despite the teasing and the poverty, she held on to something inside her that refused to break, a fire quietly growing, waiting for the right moment to shine. At school, the mocking didn't stop. The same group of kids sneered, whispering just loud enough for her to hear, but Amara started to notice something different in herself. She wasn't just surviving the words anymore, she was observing, learning, seeing patterns in how people spoke, how they acted when they thought they were better than someone else. It was like a puzzle, and every insult, every laugh thrown at her, became a piece she could use later. She tucked that thought away with her notebook, letting it simmer, letting it grow into something dangerous to those who underestimated her. By the time she reached the edge of her teenage years, the fire inside Amara was no longer quiet. It pulsed with every glance, every word, every day she spent walking through streets that reminded her of what she didn't have. And even when sleep came at night, and her body ached from too much work and too little rest, she smiled softly in the darkness. She knew, deep in her bones, that her life was not going to end in these streets. One day, the world would see her not as a poor girl, but as someone who had outgrown them all, someone they couldn't ignore, someone who held the power now they thought they had. The mornings in Lagos smelled like a mix of heat and hope, the kind of hope that made your chest ache with longing. Amara had started waking up earlier, long before the city was fully awake, just to carve out a little time for herself. She would sit on the narrow concrete steps of their house, the sun creeping up and painting long shadows across the dusty street, and read whatever book she could borrow from the tiny library at school. Each page felt like a secret doorway, a place where people didn't care about how her shoes were worn or how little money she had. She read about leaders, inventors, people who had started with nothing and ended up with everything, and every story lit a fire inside her. School remained its usual battlefield. The same kids who mocked her now whispered rumors and traded glances, trying to find new ways to belittle her. But Amara had started to notice their cracks, the small insecurities they tried to hide behind fancy clothes and smooth words. She learned to watch without reacting, to study without showing that it hurt. The more she watched, the more she understood how the world worked, how people climbed, fell, and sometimes crushed others along the way. Every insult, every sneer, became a lesson she stored away carefully in her mind, like a treasure chest of quiet power. After school, she ran errands for her mother or sold vegetables at the market. The work was exhausting, and sometimes her hands would ache so badly that she thought they might never heal, but she never complained. On days when she returned home and her stomach growled from skipping meals, she would sit under the open sky and talk to herself quietly. She made promises in whispers, not aloud, that one day she would never feel this small again. She promised herself she would rise above, not with anger, not with revenge, but with a power so clear that no one could ignore it. One evening, as the city was settling into its usual rhythm of shouting and shouting back, Amara met an old man at the market. He had eyes that seemed to see right through her, and a voice that shook with age but carried strength. He noticed the determination in her movements, the way she carried herself even though the world tried to push her down. He asked her why she worked so hard, why she didn't give up, and she simply shrugged, embarrassed that someone would even care. He smiled and said, "Life has a way of rewarding those who keep their fire burning, even when it feels impossible." That night, she carried his words with her, letting them twist inside her heart until they became part of her rhythm. At home, nights were often quiet, except for the whispers of her mother and the occasional cough from the neighbor's child. Amara would sit at the edge of her bed, staring at the wall, thinking about the future. She imagined herself in a clean office, making decisions that mattered, speaking to people who listened because they had to, not because they were kind. She imagined turning the tables, watching those who laughed at her feel the sting of their underestimation. But she also imagined doing it gently, proving herself without lowering herself to their level, showing that success wasn't just about money but about strength, skill, and intelligence. Her teenage years came and went with small victories that felt huge in her private world. She excelled in school, not to prove anyone wrong, but because she discovered a hunger inside her for knowledge she couldn't ignore. Scholarships, small competitions, moments when a teacher praised her writing or her sharp thinking, they became bricks in the foundation she was quietly building for her future. Each victory was a step further from the girl who was mocked, a step closer to the woman who would one day hold all the cards. Amara learned the art of patience, which was the most powerful weapon she had. She watched, planned, and imagined, never rushing but never stopping. Her classmates who mocked her began to graduate into young adults with their own lives, some struggling, some floating along with the illusion of control. Amara noticed it all, storing every detail, every habit, every weakness like notes in a secret journal she carried in her mind. She began speaking with more confidence, learning to command attention without raising her voice, to influence without forcing, to plant ideas that would grow into opportunities she could seize later. Her mother watched quietly, proud but cautious. She had seen her daughter bear the sting of laughter, the sharp edges of poverty, and the endless grind of hard work. She never said it out loud, but she believed in the fire Amara carried, the way it flickered in her eyes when she spoke about the future. Amara, too, carried a piece of her mother's strength inside her, a quiet defiance that made her capable of dreaming big even when the world was small. By the time Amara was 18, she had already changed in ways no one at school had predicted. She walked taller, spoke with an authority that was rare for someone her age, and carried herself with a confidence that had been forged in the hardest fire of her life. People still underestimated her, assuming she was just another young girl from a poor neighborhood, but she had learned how to make them regret it without them realizing why. She had begun to write plans, business ideas, small ventures that she could start with almost nothing, ideas she nurtured quietly while the rest of the world slept or laughed at her. Every night, she sat under the stars, thinking about the people who mocked her, imagining the moment when she would step into a world that had once sneered at her and show them all how far she had come. She didn't want revenge, she wanted power, influence, a life so full that no one could doubt her place in it. And somewhere in the quiet of those nights, with the city whispering below, Amara began to feel the first real taste of what it would mean to be unstoppable, the first thrill of knowing that her time was coming, and it would be nothing like anyone expected. This builds her teenage years, her growing intelligence, her patience, and the careful steps she takes toward becoming a force people cannot ignore. It sets up the next episode for her first real taste of control and the beginnings of her professional rise. Amara stepped into adulthood with a quiet confidence that had been forged through years of struggle. At first, she tried finding small jobs that paid barely enough to survive, but each one became a lesson. She learned how businesses worked, how people negotiated, how power could hide in the smallest gestures and words. One day, while working at a tiny accounting office, she watched her boss handle clients with a mix of charm and authority, and she realized that power wasn't just about money, It was about understanding people, knowing what they wanted before they did, and making them feel they needed you. She took notes in her mind every day, cataloging the mistakes others made, the opportunities they overlooked. One co-worker constantly bragged about connections he didn't actually have, and Amara quietly observed how quickly people's respect evaporated when the truth came out. Another would make decisions without thinking, rushing for recognition and failing spectacularly. Amara began to understand that patience, intelligence, and timing were more valuable than loud voices and flashy appearances. She didn't just want to succeed, she wanted to rise in a way that no one could touch her, a rise so quiet and so calculated that when it happened, it would be undeniable. The office was small, the pay was low, but the lessons were priceless. She stayed late, not because anyone told her to, but because she had a hunger that couldn't be satisfied with ordinary work. She spoke politely to clients, learned the lingo, memorized the numbers, and slowly, people started to notice. They didn't notice her brilliance yet, they just noticed that she never faltered, that she seemed to understand more than she should, that she anticipated problems before anyone else. Meanwhile, her past never left her. She remembered the sneers of her classmates, the way they had mocked her torn uniform, her worn shoes, her quiet poverty. She carried those memories like a quiet fire, not as hatred, but as fuel. Every insult she had endured became a building block, each one making her stronger, sharper, more determined. She started to imagine a day when she could help those who were once powerless and, at the same time, hold influence over those who had looked down on her. It wasn't revenge she sought, it was balance. As the months passed, she found herself networking quietly, connecting with people who could help her grow. She attended workshops, stayed after meetings to ask questions, and took every opportunity to learn from anyone who had even a hint of experience. She realized that most people were too arrogant or lazy to notice the smaller details, the subtle hints that could give someone a decisive edge. Amara noticed everything. Every pause in a conversation, every hesitation, every slip of pride, she stored it all. Then came the day she encountered someone who would change the course of her life. A woman named Kyoma, a rising executive in a fast-growing company, came to Amara's office with a proposal. Kyoma was sharp, confident, and intimidating, but she spoke with respect to Amara. The first time they met, Amara stayed quiet, listening, absorbing every word. Kyoma recognized the potential in her, the fire she had worked so hard to conceal, the intelligence she had honed through years of struggle. She offered Amara a small role in her company, a chance to prove herself on a bigger stage. It wasn't much, but it was everything Amara had been waiting for. Her first day at Kyoma's company was overwhelming. The offices were modern, polished, alive with people who walked as though the world belonged to them. Some glanced at Amara with thinly veiled disdain, assuming she was just another inexperienced girl. But Amara walked with her head high, her mind focused, her heart steady. She listened more than she spoke, observed more than she reacted. Every challenge was an opportunity, every question a chance to learn, every mistake a chance to grow. Slowly, word began to spread about her competence. A client was impressed by her meticulous preparation, another noticed how she anticipated problems before they occurred. Her reputation grew quietly, like a river gaining strength, unnoticed until it became unstoppable. The same classmates who had once mocked her would now never suspect the woman they once laughed at could one day influence decisions that mattered in a city that had once looked down on her. Amara also began learning the unspoken rules of office politics. She saw who wielded influence, who manipulated power, and who got ahead by taking shortcuts that would eventually fail. She stayed out of gossip, stayed out of petty arguments, but she watched, always learning. She noticed weaknesses and strengths, alliances and rivalries, and she kept track of them with the precision of a general studying a battlefield. Her nights were filled with work and planning. She spent hours researching markets, reading about successful companies, studying patterns of growth and collapse. Her small apartment became a command center of ideas, her worn notebook filled with strategies that she would one day turn into action. The fire in her grew stronger with every passing day. She didn't just want to succeed, she wanted to control, to have a say in decisions that could change lives, to reach the place where no one could laugh at her past again. One evening, while reviewing reports late into the night, she received an email from Kyoma. It was a note praising her for spotting a critical error that could have cost the company thousands. Kyoma wrote that she had noticed Amara's talent and wanted to discuss a bigger opportunity. Amara felt a thrill she had never known before, a mix of validation, anticipation, and power. It was a glimpse of the world she had been working toward, the world she had imagined under the stars on quiet nights when the city was asleep. The next morning, she walked into the office with a new sense of purpose. She was no longer just surviving, no longer just enduring. She was becoming someone who could shape the world around her, someone who could rise above the people who had mocked her, someone who could take control without anyone realizing until it was already too late. The fire inside her had grown into a blaze, and soon, it would become a force that no one, not even those who had once looked down on her, could ignore. Amara's life began to shift in ways she had only dreamed of, yet every day still demanded the same relentless focus. The small office where she once walked quietly among indifferent colleagues had become a launching pad, a place where every decision she made could ripple outward in ways she was only beginning to understand. Kayama kept her close, assigning her projects that seemed small at first, but each contained lessons about influence, leadership, and control. Amara approached each task with a rigor that was almost frightening, analyzing every report, anticipating every problem, and planning every solution before anyone else could even see the issue. The city itself seemed to recognize her hunger. Lagos was alive with energy, people jostling for position, some climbing, some stumbling, and Amara moved quietly through it all, absorbing everything. She noticed the small patterns that others ignored, which clients were reliable, which partnerships could collapse, which people spoke with honesty and which hid ulterior motives. She began compiling mental maps of influence, seeing where opportunities lay hidden behind veils of arrogance or ignorance. It wasn't long before her diligence began to pay off. One afternoon, a meeting was called with a group of high-profile investors who were considering pouring money into a new venture. The senior managers stumbled over projections, fumbling numbers, while Amara, seated quietly in the corner, noticed an inconsistency that would have cost millions. Without hesitation, she spoke up, laying out the problem and offering a solution that no one had considered. There was silence in the room, then slow nods of approval. Kayama's eyes met hers across the table, filled with a quiet pride that said more than any words could. From that moment, Amara realized she could step into rooms where decisions were made and have people listen, not because of her age, her background, or her appearance, but because she commanded respect through knowledge and insight. Her confidence grew, but she never let it spill over into arrogance. She knew too well how quickly pride could collapse under the weight of reality. Instead, she sharpened her instincts, honed her skills, and built a reputation as someone whose presence meant solutions, not problems. Word of her capability spread quietly, from client to client, from manager to manager. Those who had once dismissed her as inexperienced began to defer to her judgment without even realizing why. And yet, the ghosts of her past still lingered. On days when she walked the streets, she occasionally caught glimpses of the same faces that had mocked her, people who had once pointed and laughed at her tattered shoes, at her humble uniform, at her quiet determination. Sometimes, their laughter had become their own undoing, their arrogance making them careless, while Amara had quietly built a network of influence and knowledge that would carry her far beyond their reach. The memory of their ridicule no longer hurt, it fueled her. Every insult, every moment of scorn, became a tool she could use to anticipate, to strategize, to rise. It was during one of these days, as she walked through a crowded market on her way to a meeting, that she first recognized the power of timing. She had spotted a potential partner for Kayama's company, a rising entrepreneur whose ideas were promising but whose presentation skills were clumsy. While others might have ignored him, dismissed him as inexperienced, Amara approached him with a careful blend of encouragement and guidance. She showed him how to refine his pitch, how to anticipate questions, and how to present confidence even when he felt none. By the next meeting, he had transformed, and the deal went through. Kayama later praised her ability to recognize potential where others saw risk. Amara realized then that influence was not just about climbing herself, but about lifting others strategically to create an environment where her power could grow. Her personal life remained quiet. She spent late nights planning, reading, and observing. Friends were few, and intimacy was rare, because she understood that distraction could dilute her focus. Even as her colleagues socialized after work, Amara often lingered in her office, reviewing contracts, imagining scenarios, calculating outcomes. It was a discipline born from years of scarcity, a practice she had refined into a powerful habit. Amara's reputation grew so quietly that many of her colleagues barely realized the scale of her ascent until it was undeniable. She was offered leadership of small teams, then larger projects. Each promotion was a test, a chance to prove that her intellect, her patience, and her strategic thinking could manage not just numbers and reports, but people. She learned the delicate balance of authority, how to command respect without inciting resentment, how to correct mistakes without embarrassing someone, how to influence decisions subtly until the outcome was exactly what she envisioned. Meanwhile, the classmates who had mocked her continued to drift through their own lives, some struggling with dead-end jobs, some floating on temporary success. Amara heard stories of them, sometimes by coincidence, sometimes from people she trusted, and she catalogued their weaknesses quietly. She did not act out of malice, but she understood the inevitability of the moment when her rise would intersect with their fall. She knew that power, once earned and sharpened, would place her in a position where she could influence not just her destiny, but theirs. The day came when Kyoma entrusted her with a critical negotiation that could make or break a major project. Amara approached it with the calm precision that had become her hallmark. She entered the room, studied the clients, anticipated objections, and led the discussion with an authority that left no doubt. By the end, the deal was secured, and Amara emerged not just as a skilled strategist, but as a force whose insight and preparation commanded respect. Kyoma's smile after the meeting was subtle but meaningful, a recognition that Amara had passed a threshold. She was no longer just a talented newcomer. She was a leader in her own right, poised to shape outcomes and influence people at a level that few imagined possible. As she left the building that evening, the Lagos sun was setting, painting the city in warm tones that mirrored her inner state. The streets were crowded, full of people hurrying home or chasing their own ambitions, but Amara moved through them with a sense of calm inevitability. The fire that had burned quietly in her youth had grown into a blaze of calculated strength. She had learned patience, intelligence, timing, and strategy. She had transformed every insult, every hardship, and every setback into fuel. And she knew that the next phase of her journey was approaching, a phase where her influence would no longer be quiet, where the people who had doubted her would see the force she had become, where the power she had built would finally meet the world that once mocked her. Amara's rise continued, but it was no longer quiet. By now, her name carried weight, whispered in meetings and repeated in conversations where she wasn't even present. Every opportunity she had nurtured, every lesson she had painstakingly learned from her years of struggle, had brought her to a point where she could operate at a level most of her former peers could not even imagine. The city itself seemed to bend around her focus, its chaos now a backdrop to her precise, deliberate movements. Kyoma had begun trusting her with increasingly complex projects. One of the most significant came when the company was negotiating with a multinational firm that had ignored small Nigerian startups for years. The executives were sharp, intimidating, and accustomed to dealing with people who assumed they had the upper hand. Amara entered the room with a quiet confidence, her portfolio in hand, her arguments rehearsed but flexible, her mind scanning for every possible angle. She anticipated every question, every objection, and she guided the discussion with such clarity that the other side began to recognize not only her intelligence, but her subtle authority. Her colleagues watched in awe. Many had underestimated her in the past, dismissing her quiet demeanor, her humble background, or her age. But in this meeting, Amara was undeniable. She was not loud, she did not raise her voice, she did not boast. Yet every word she spoke carried weight, every pause she allowed built tension that she controlled, every choice of emphasis shifted perception. By the end, the multinational executives leaned forward, nodding, and finally agreed to a deal that would make the company a major player in the region. Amara stepped out of the boardroom, her heart steady, her mind already calculating the next move. She knew the value of perception. She knew that the people who once mocked her could not yet see her as a threat, and that made them vulnerable. But she was not reckless. She had learned patience, the art of waiting until her power was absolute, until her influence could no longer be ignored. The idea of confronting them prematurely had no appeal. Her satisfaction would be total, complete, and undeniable. Her personal life, still quiet, was now dominated by ambition. She had a small circle of trusted confidants, people she could rely on for advice and perspective, but she rarely shared her larger plans. Trust was precious, mistakes were costly. Every relationship outside her professional world was filtered through the lens of focus and utility. Her nights were long, spent reviewing deals, refining strategies, and imagining scenarios where she could maximize impact. She would think of her mother, still working tirelessly, still proud, and every sacrifice she had ever made became fuel for Amara's resolve. One evening, she received a report about a former classmate, someone who had once sneered at her in school, now struggling to maintain a job at a minor firm. The contrast was stark, and Amara felt no malice, only a quiet, steady satisfaction. She understood the irony. The world had not treated him with kindness, but her own preparation and perseverance had positioned her far above the reach of past ridicule. It was not revenge she sought, it was proof of her capability, proof of her foresight, proof of the fire she had nurtured in silence for years. Amara's reputation grew beyond the company. Investors began to seek her out, impressed by her ability to navigate complex negotiations, manage projects with precision, and anticipate challenges before they emerged. Each successful project expanded her network, increased her credibility, and added layers of influence she had been quietly building since her childhood. Every triumph reinforced her confidence, every misstep she avoided sharpened her instincts. She was becoming not just a professional powerhouse, but a strategist whose presence commanded attention, whose judgment was trusted, whose vision shaped outcomes. It was during this time that Amara realized the true power of control. She had learned not only to excel in her own work but to understand and guide the ambitions of others. She could now position people in ways that would maximize results, foresee conflicts before they arose, and manipulate circumstances subtly to achieve the outcome she wanted. She did this with such finesse that no one ever suspected her hand, yet the results were unmistakable. She began to see the potential for influence not just in projects, but in people themselves, people who had once dismissed her, people who had underestimated her. The first opportunity to exercise this fully came when a former classmate, now in a junior position at her company, sought her help with a project. He did not recognize her at first, only seeing a senior executive willing to mentor. Amara recognized him immediately, every memory of mockery and laughter etched clearly in her mind. Yet she did not act on impulse. She guided him, advised him, provided resources, all while subtly shaping his decisions so that the results aligned with her vision. She was in control, yet invisible in her dominance, turning what could have been a petty confrontation into a demonstration of mastery and foresight. Her mother noticed the change in her daughter. The quiet girl who once carried tomatoes and notebooks now returned home from offices she could hardly have imagined as a child, her steps measured, her mind alert, her presence commanding. Amara's success was no longer a dream, it was tangible, visible, and growing every day. And yet she remained grounded, never forgetting the street she had walked, the hand she had held while selling vegetables, the evening she had spent dreaming under the faint light of the stars. Those memories shaped her decisions, reminded her of her roots, and gave her the clarity to wield her power responsibly. Amara's life had transformed, but she knew the final phase of her journey was approaching. She had built influence, earned respect, and commanded attention in ways that few could challenge. Yet the true test would come when she confronted the past, when she intersected with the very people who had once mocked her. She had the knowledge, the resources, and the strategy to assert her position, but it had to be done with precision. The fire that had burned quietly for years now glowed with a fierce intensity, ready to become a blaze that would illuminate the difference between the girl she had been and the woman she had become. Every deal she closed, every strategy she executed, every subtle maneuver she orchestrated brought her closer to that moment. She was no longer the girl who walked carefully past laughter and sneers. She was a force whose judgment shaped outcomes, whose presence commanded respect, whose mind calculated results with surgical precision. And in the quiet moments, when the city lights shimmered outside her office window, Amara allowed herself a rare smile, knowing that the day was coming when her fire would meet the world that had once doubted her, and there would be no question about the power she now held. Amara stood at the edge of the office balcony, the city of Lagos sprawled beneath her like a living, breathing puzzle she had slowly learned to decode. The lights of the buildings shimmered like tiny promises, each one a story, a life, a possibility. She thought about the years that had brought her here, the morning she woke before sunrise to help her mother, the evening she spent under dim light scribbling dreams into a battered notebook, the insults, the laughter, the moments of doubt she had quietly turned into fuel. Every step, every hardship, every ounce of struggle had led to this point. The company had grown under her guidance, branching into new markets, negotiating deals that once seemed impossible. Her influence was no longer subtle, it had become undeniable. People who had once underestimated her now deferred to her judgment, seeking her approval, valuing her insight. And yet, her most significant challenge wasn't a deal, a project, or a strategy. It was the reckoning with her past, the people who had once mocked her, laughed at her poverty, and assumed she could never rise. One afternoon, a familiar voice interrupted a strategy meeting. She looked up and froze, her mind instantly recognizing the man who had been the ringleader of the mockery in her school days. He was older now, thinner in some ways, slower in others, but the arrogance was still there, wrapped in the false confidence of a mediocre career that had barely taken him past the limits of his small ambitions. He walked in expecting her to be the same girl he had once mocked, expecting that she would be unaware, that she would still be beneath him in every possible way. Amara let him speak first, listening carefully, noting every hesitation, every misstep, every unconscious reveal of insecurity. She didn't rush to confront him. Patience had taught her more than any book or strategy session ever could. She allowed him to lay his assumptions bare, to act as if nothing had changed, to believe he still held power in this interaction. Every word he spoke, every glance he threw her way, was a brick in the foundation she had been quietly preparing to build above him. Then she spoke. Her voice was calm, clear, commanding. She outlined her vision for the new project, highlighted her achievements, and subtly reminded him of the network, the influence, and the authority she now held. There was no malice, no gloating. Just facts, precision, and a presence that filled the room without needing to raise her voice. The man's face went pale as the realization hit. The girl he had mocked, the one he assumed would never rise, now held power over decisions that directly affected his career. Amara didn't stop there. She had spent years preparing for this moment. She guided him gently but firmly, demonstrating exactly how the project would succeed under her leadership. She offered him a position, but one carefully calculated, one that made him dependent on her guidance, forced him to acknowledge her authority, and removed any opportunity for him to challenge her. Every move was deliberate, strategic, and executed with the precision of someone who had spent a lifetime learning patience, observation, and influence. In that moment, the power balance had shifted completely. The room, once a place where she had silently endured humiliation in her youth, became her stage. Every colleague, every client, every observer could see it. Amara was no longer a girl to be mocked, no longer someone to underestimate. She was a leader, a strategist, a woman whose fire had grown into a force unstoppable by anyone who had once doubted her. And yet, it wasn't only about the humiliation or the reversal of roles. Amara had grown beyond that. The satisfaction she felt was not rooted in revenge, but in mastery. She had taken the lessons of her youth, the hardships, the laughter, the struggles, and transformed them into power, insight, and resilience. The past, instead of breaking her, had become the engine driving her ascent. Months passed, and her influence extended further than even she had imagined. She began mentoring young talent, offering guidance to people who reminded her of herself at their age, hungry, underestimated, but full of potential. She nurtured their growth with the same meticulous care she had once invested in her own development, ensuring that the cycle of struggle and triumph could continue in others. Her former classmates drifted in and out of her orbit, some seeking advice, some forced to collaborate, all quietly recognizing that she was now in control. She never gloated, never lowered herself to petty confrontations. Her success was a quiet, undeniable force, evident in the way decisions flowed through her hands, the way projects flourished under her leadership, and the way people sought her counsel without knowing exactly why. Even her mother noticed the transformation, the power that radiated from her daughter. She had once worried about the little girl who walked barefoot on uneven streets, the girl whose laughter had been drowned by mockery. Now she saw the woman who commanded rooms, who shaped outcomes, who had turned every ounce of hardship into a force that could not be denied. Her pride was deep, unspoken, a quiet echo of the sacrifices she had made that had fueled Amara's ascent. Amara herself knew that the journey was far from over. Power, influence, and mastery were not endpoints, they were tools. Tools to shape not only her destiny but the destinies of those around her. She had achieved what many thought impossible, and yet she continued to refine her strategies, to observe, to plan, to anticipate. The fire that had once been small and fragile now burned like a controlled blaze, illuminating paths others could not see, guiding her through challenges, and preparing her for even greater heights. And on quiet nights, when the city slept below her office window, she allowed herself a rare reflection. She remembered the girl who had walked carefully past sneers, The evenings spent under dim light writing dreams into notebooks, the countless moments of doubt and struggle. And she smiled softly, knowing that the girl she once was had never truly disappeared. She had evolved, grown stronger, and transformed her past into a foundation for the extraordinary power she now held. Amara had become the boss, the one who controlled not only projects but careers, the one whose insight and strategy dictated outcomes. Those who had once mocked her now had no choice but to acknowledge her authority, not because she had sought revenge, but because she had prepared, endured, and executed with precision for years. And in that quiet, unshakable mastery, Amara found the greatest satisfaction, proof that no amount of mockery, poverty, or doubt could ever contain the fire of determination, the brilliance of strategy, and the relentless pursuit of a destiny she had always known she was capable of achieving. Amara's journey reminds us that no matter where you start, determination, patience, and focus can turn even the harshest struggles into unstoppable power. From a girl mocked for her poverty to a leader who shapes careers and commands respect, her story proves that resilience and strategy can change everything. If you were inspired by Amara's journey, don't forget to subscribe for more stories that empower and captivate. We'd love to hear from you. Tell us in the comments which country you're watching from and what time it is there right now. Your story matters to us, and we want to celebrate your moment with you.